So today we're gonna make an einkorn sourdough cinnamon raisin bread. This is a delicious and comforting fall bread. My favorite way to eat this bread is serve it up with honey butter. You can just mix some butter and honey in a bowl and top that on top of the bread. You can toast the bread in the morning. We like to throw some of this in the toaster and then put fried eggs on top and have the yolk kind of all over it. So good. This recipe uses a sourdough starter, which is basically flour and water if you don't know what that is. It's very easy to make. I have a tutorial on how to make sourdough starter. I'll leave the link for that below if you want to get started. But you're basically replacing the yeast in the bread, so you're just using sourdough starter and no yeast to make it rise. In order to do that, you have to feed it flour and water. So I did that this morning, and then this evening is when I'm starting this bread, and then I will bake it tomorrow. And I'll leave a link below to where you can find a full timeline if you're new at bread making and you're like, what time do I do everything? I'll have it all listed out, although it's not that rigid, and I promise it's easier than it might sound. Starting with sourdough starter, you want to make sure your starter is bubbly and active. This is so that you get a rise out of the bread without using yeast. So if you are brand new to sourdough starter, all this is flour and water. And you hear me talk about sourdough a lot on my channel because I make sourdough bread every week with this starter that you're looking at right here. So I fed it this morning, so it's been sitting all day, and that's how I know it's ready to go. So I'm gonna take 1 cup of sourdough starter, 1 1/4 cup filtered water, 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt, and mix that together with a fork. I actually already added those ingredients before I started filming, so that's where I'm at here. To that you want to add 1/4 cup of honey and 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. This is going to give it that really nice fall flavor. I am not usually a fan of flavored breads, but this is the kind of recipe that you can make for breakfast, so it's not like a sugary sweet dessert. It's just basically a regular loaf of bread, but there's a little bit of honey in it, which to me reminds me of making English muffins in the morning and having like a honey butter. And that is so delicious, and it's light enough to be a breakfast without feeling like dessert. It is amazing what this cinnamon does to the bread. So good. I'm gonna combine that with a fork again. It's kind of nice to not have any processed sugar in here, like white sugar or anything. Makes it very clean. Okay, now is the fun part. We're going to add our einkorn flour. You might be wondering why I'm using einkorn flour. I've talked about einkorn flour a little bit on my channel before, so you might already know this. But if you don't, it's basically an ancient grain that is non-hybridized, which in summary is a genetic modification process that they do to modern wheat so that it grows easier and more plentiful. However, that process strips away a lot of the nice original qualities of the grain. So you can do that research on your own and read about that. But when you don't do that hybridization process, the grain is a lot healthier for you and easier to digest. It's higher in protein, lower in gluten. So we try to buy einkorn flour for our pasta and everything, but it makes a more difficult loaf of bread. So I actually make sourdough bread every week, multiple times a week, using regular all-purpose flour. So I'm not saying that I never use regular flour. In fact, I enjoy using regular flour a lot for bread, but I've been trying to master the einkorn sourdough loaf because einkorn just absorbs water differently. It's kind of a grainier, heavier flour, and so it's harder to get that light and fluffy loaf. But when you add some honey, like I'm doing today, and cinnamon and raisins, it's so delicious. So I hope you enjoyed this recipe, especially if you're an einkorn lover. Let me know in the comments below if you are interested in more einkorn recipes, because I really like cooking with einkorn. So you're gonna want to start this recipe the day before you want to make the bread. So you're going to add a heaping 4 1/2 cups of einkorn flour, but that is not super rigid. You kind of want to keep an eye out for the texture of this bread and see how it looks compared to what I'm doing here, and I'll talk you through it as well. But the truth is that it depends on your type of flour, the environment in your house, your starter, all these things. So the amount of flour that you're going to add might vary, but rest assured that no matter what, you're gonna have a great loaf of bread. It's just that bread taking takes a little bit of practice and getting to know the dough. So be patient and never throw away your loaf of bread, that's for sure. If it doesn't turn out how you liked, just keep trying and you'll get it. And you're gonna mix this up. I like to use my hands. Okay, so on the consistency, you want to have a dough that forms. So it shouldn't be like liquidy. You wanna see a nice dough forming. However, it is going to be very sticky, and that's okay. So if you find that your dough is very liquidy, try to add more flour. If it's very, very stiff, you might want to add more water. Okay, so I'm gonna let the dough rest and the einkorn flour is going to absorb all the water. Magical things are gonna happen, and then I will come back to it. I'm going to cover it with a tea towel and let it sit at room temperature for 30 minutes to an hour. It's not super rigid, but you do wanna let it sit for probably at least 30 minutes. Okay, so after you've let the bread dough sit for 30 minutes to an hour, you're gonna do a stretch and fold. So you're basically just going to lift up 4 different times, so 1 on each corner of the bread as if the bread was square, and then fold it over itself. But before we do that, we're gonna add a cup of raisins. Now this is optional. I don't usually have raisins on hand, but when I made this bread a few times while I was getting it ready for this recipe, it was so good, and I just felt like raisins was the one thing that was missing. So I'm gonna add it, but just know that you don't have to. The cinnamon alone, it makes this bread delicious. And you're just getting the raisins all nice and combined. They almost look like chocolate chips from my view here. So another thing I like to do sometimes is just grab the whole dough like this and just pull it and then fold it into itself. This is just a little bread handling technique that I've picked up on as I've made many, many, many hundreds of loaves of bread. And then you're going to cover that back up, and I'm gonna do that same process 2 more times with about an hour in between each stretch and fold. So you'll do a total of 3 stretch and folds at a minimum. If you can do a 4th one, that would be even better. You want your temperature in your house to be about 70 degrees. So if it's super hot, like 75 or above, then you don't need to wait even an hour. You will probably see that the bread is fermenting quickly because of the heat. Whereas if the temperature is colder in your house, like 65, you might want to let it go 2 hours in between each time. So you'll have to just gauge it based on the temperature in your house. Now I'm gonna pop in here and say this before I'm actually done, because I'm gonna do the rest of this at night and it will be too dark to film. But before I go to bed, after I've done this 3 or 4 times, I'm gonna cover the bowl with plastic wrap and then put it in the fridge, and it will do a long ferment overnight in the fridge. In the fridge. The reason you cover with plastic wrap is so that no air can get in. You don't want it to be sealed, but you just don't want any air to get in so that it stays nice and moist. So I will pick this back up tomorrow and show you what it looks like when we bake it. Okay, so it is the next day and I have my einkorn sourdough cinnamon raisin bread ready to bake. So last night I covered it with plastic and put it in the refrigerator to long ferment. This morning I pulled it out around 8 a.m. and it's actually about 1 o'clock right now. So it's been sitting quite a while. You don't need to let it sit that long, but we were out and about this morning, and so that's how long it sat. Sourdough bread is really not that picky when it comes to the timing. You can have it sit out for an hour or 3 hours. I would say anything longer than that, the bread can actually over ferment and it will rise, reach its peak, and then it will go back down. So you do have to be careful about that. So I preheated my oven to 450 degrees and I put the Dutch oven in it. So you really want to have a very nice hot environment for your bread to bake in. Once the Dutch oven is preheated at 450, I'm going to score the loaf, put the lid on, and then bake it for about 20 minutes. And then I'll take the lid off and bake it for another 10 to 20 minutes. can go the whole 20 minutes for a really crispy browned bread, or just stop at about 10 if you want a lighter, softer bread. So when it's done baking, you want to take it out of the oven and leave it out for about an hour. I know you're going to want to cut into it, but just like with all sourdough loaves, it's actually really important that you don't cut into it for an hour. You will listen that it will continue to bake and rise when you pull it out of the oven. So transfer it to like a cooling rack and just let it sit for at least an hour. You'll hear like this crackling noise. It's very magical when you pull that loaf out of the oven. So then you're going to want to slice it. I use a bread slicing tool here. You can also use a serrated knife, so either one will work. I spent my first couple of years with bread making using a serrated knife, and I loved it. And then I actually got this as a gift, and once I got used to using this, I started liking it a lot better because it can really control like the thickness of the slice if you've ever cut bread and it's inconsistently thick or something. So that's a good one. Well, I hope you enjoyed this recipe for einkorn sourdough cinnamon raisin bread. It will be a staple in your household for sure if you make it this fall and into winter. It's a nice variation on making your regular bread, but just adding a little more flavor too. If you're brand new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. Every week I post a new video on farm-to-table recipes and homemade natural living, sourdough, from scratch recipes and baking, and some home decor too. Thank you so much for stopping by the Duval Homestead.